أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. جميع الأنظار متجهة نحو معركة الوصول إلى البيت الأبيض. يقول البعض إن جميع السياسيين متشابهون، لكن دونالد ترامب وكامالا هاريس مختلفان تماما بالقدر الذي ينبغي أن يكون عليه أي مرشحين متنافسين. الانتخابات الرئاسية ليست الانتخابات الوحيدة في نوفمبر المقبل، بل سيصوت الأميركيون أيضا لاختيار جميع أعضاء مجلس النواب البالغ عددهم 435 عضوا، واختيار ثلث أعضاء مجلس الشيوخ البالغ عددهم 100 عضو. نتيجة هذه الانتخابات مهمة أيضا. في مجلس النواب يتمتع الجمهوريون حاليا بهامش أغلبية قليل، فهم يزيدون ب4 مقاعد فقط عن الديمقراطيين. يمكن أن يتحول ذلك بسهولة إلى السيطرة الديمقراطيين في نوفمبر. أما مجلس الشيوخ فإن هامش الأغلبية الديمقراطية أصغر حجما، فهو يزيد بمقعد واحد عن الجمهوريين، ويمكن أن يتحول ذلك بسهولة إلى سيطرة الجمهوريين أيضا في نوفمبر. ما العلاقة بين السباق الرئاسي والتنافس للسيطرة على مجلسي النواب والشيوخ؟ كيف توزع الأحزاب السياسية أموالها وجهودها؟ كم عدد الناخبين الذين يصوتون لحزبهم المفضل أو ربما يصوتون المرشحين الأفراد؟ لمناقشة السباق على مقاعد الكونغرس وارتباطه بالسباق الرئاسي، يسعدني أن أرحب بمجموعة من الخبراء السياسيين ناومي ليم وأليكس بولتون وسارة فارس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We have hundreds, thousands of elections in November, not just the one between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Everyone knows about that one, but voters will also choose local, county, state, and federal officials. Everything from dog catcher in Springfield, Ohio, but that's a different story, to senators and congressmen across the country. Let's take a look at these elections, or at least some of the most important ones, the ones for Congress, with Alex Bolton, Naomi Lim, and Sarah Ferris. All right, first, some big picture questions. We have two major political parties, two presidential candidates. How much do they care, focus, and spend on these other elections, the Senate and House elections, when they have a big presidential vote to worry about? Alex?
Well, quite a bit, because if you're Kamala Harris and you're president, but Republicans control the Senate, you're going to have a real difficulty getting anything done. You're going to have difficulty just filling your cabinet, appointing judges to appellate court seats, to district court seats. Already, John Thune, the Senate Republican whip, who's the front runner to become the new Senate Republican leader, says that if Republicans are in control of the Senate, Kamala Harris and the Democrats, if they do control the White House, will have to think long and hard about whom they appoint, because they're not going to have an easy time getting through the Senate. So this is very important, and that's why Harris has transferred $10 million from her campaign to the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee so that Democratic candidates can win these key races and keep control, although right now Republicans are favored to win back the Senate majority, which means that we're probably going to see divided government in Washington next year.
All right, we'll get to that in just a moment. But Sarah, let me ask you, from a voter's perspective, do voters generally tend to vote for the party or for the candidate? Are there a lot of voters that may split their voting for the presidential candidate of one party, but maybe the Senate candidate of another party. What is our tradition?
Well, it's become a lot less common to see those so-called ticket-splitting voters. And you can look at just what's been happening in Congress. There's no longer as many competitive seats. For a long time, you would see dozens and dozens of members who would be really at risk each cycle. After the Obama administration, for instance, had a real debacle with the rollout of Obamacare, in those midterms, they lost enormous amounts of seats. And suddenly there was the Republicans controlled more than 60-seat majority. We just don't see that kind of ticket splitting anymore. Where if voters are going to vote for a party, they typically will vote for the same member of that party, for the president, for the Senate, for the House, and that's something that it has just been consolidating as partisan politics in the U.S. has become increasingly bitter, increasingly partisan, and so ticket splitting is just simply something we don't see that much anymore. Even though that there are members of the Republican Party in particular in the House that are trying to stress to their voters that they should do that this time around, with candidates like Donald Trump who are really struggling in national polls. They're hoping to bring back that this cycle.
And Naomi, I mean, a president is historically the head of his party. Do they tend to play significant roles in the congressional and Senate races? Do they help choose candidates? Are they active in these congressional races, or do they leave that to the party officials?
Well, it's sort of interesting what Sarah said in terms of the Republicans trying to distance themselves from sort of maybe Trump politics, particularly in places like in New York and California, which in my mind might sort of decide the House. What I found really interesting on the Democratic side of things is the way that things have sort of changed and evolved when we had President Joe Biden on top of the ticket versus now when we have Vice President Kamala Harris. You know, at the very sort of, even at the start of this year, but mainly towards the middle of this year, before the debate and after the debate, there were very few candidates that were in competitive races that would attend events that Biden would go to in these battleground states. For example, in Michigan or in Wisconsin or in Pennsylvania, where those Senate seats, they have incumbents, Democrats are the incumbents, but they didn't want to sort of be seen to be sort of really close to Biden. I mean, maybe Pennsylvania was the one example where Bob Casey would embrace Joe Biden. But since we've had the vice president elevated to the top of the ticket, you're seeing a lot more people. I mean, I thought it was so notable when she went to Wisconsin, the very sort of after she sort of became the nominee or the presumptive nominee, you had someone like Senator Tammy Baldwin coming to her events. And so while they might not do a lot in terms of picking, I think that is a lot of the party structure. I think they are so tied to the national trend in the way that people are feeling about politics, to what Sarah was saying about this sort of lack of ticket splitting. I think they're fundamental in that way.
All right, very interesting. All right, let's take a look at each of these houses of Congress. Alex, you mentioned the Senate a few moments ago. Currently, the Democrats control the Senate by a very narrow margin. Every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for election. How does it look this year?
Well, Republicans are favored to win back the majority. And now what you have to keep in mind is if it's a 50-50 tie, then whatever party controls the White House also controls the Senate majority. And of course, we saw that during President Biden's first 2 years in office. Now, right now, Democrats have a 51 to 49 seat majority, except they are expected to lose the seat now held by Joe Manchin, the centrist. He was a Democrat. Now he's an independent from West Virginia. He's retiring. The popular governor, Jim Justice, is 34 points ahead in the polls. So that's a certain Republican pickup. That takes you to 50-50. Now, if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, Democrats will retain the Senate majority if they don't lose any other seats. However, it looks very likely they will lose the Montana Senate seat held by John Tester. He has served 3 terms in the Senate, but right now he's down about 4 points in the polls to his Republican challenger in Montana. Donald Trump is expected to win Montana by more than 10 points. And as you heard Sarah and Naomi explain, ticket splitting just isn't that prevalent. Yes, an incumbent senator or maybe even House member can run a few points ahead of the top of the ticket. But the idea that Jon Tester is going to outperform Kamala Harris by more than 10 points in Montana, or whatever the margin of victory is that Trump's going to have, that's very hard to envision. Now, Tester's only down by 4 points, but the expectation is that as we get closer to Election Day, people will coalesce, people will vote down ballot as they do at the top of the ticket, and he faces a very tough road. So if Tester loses, that means, and he's the Democrat in Montana, that means Democrats would then have to knock off a Republican incumbent, either Ted Cruz in Texas or Rick Scott in Florida. Both those Republicans are fairly unpopular in their home states. However, they are very Republican states. Texas has become a little bit more Democratic in recent years, but it would be a major upset if the Democrats knocked off either Cruz in Texas, Rick Scott in Florida. So given Jon Tester's tough road to re-election, given that Joe Manchin's seat is going to go Republican, right now the handicappers say Republicans will most likely control the Senate in 2025. All
right, so let's get the predictions of our fellow panelists. You just heard Alex say there's a high probability that the Republicans take the Senate. What do you think, Sarah?
I think that sounds pretty good. I mean, that's those are exactly what we're seeing in the polls. I think the question is what can change before November? And in the House, it's looking like everything is going to be coming down to what happens at the presidential level. This almost always happens in House races. Of course, senators can have a bigger brand. It's more common to see a senator, for example, Sherrod Brown in Ohio. He could still win Ohio, even if Donald Trump wins the state of Ohio. That's he has a huge personality, a huge brand. That doesn't happen so much in House races. These are, of course, folks who have a much smaller set of voters to help. It's much harder for them to have their own brand. So in the House, we're looking at about 24 seats, half held by Democrats, half held by Republicans, and all of these are pure toss-ups. No one knows how they're going to fall. Democrats are hoping that recent momentum can help propel them to take back the House. But this will again depend on is there anything in the next couple of weeks ahead of the election that's going to shift the political fortune for Kamala Harris? She's been really surging. The party's really been surging in polls. However, nationally and in a lot of key states, it remains almost tied. So a lot of Democrats and Republican operatives in these House races are thinking this could absolutely go either way. No one is willing to make a prediction. It's really going to depend on what happens the next couple of weeks.
All right. So Naomi, both your colleagues said that the likelihood of Republicans taking the Senate is high. First, do you agree with that? And then secondly, what impact do you think does the presidential race itself have when we begin to look at the House of Representatives, and this equal, almost divided down the middle situation that chamber now faces?
Yeah, I totally agree with Alex and Sarah. I think the Senate, I think the institutional sort of conventional wisdom is that Republicans will keep it. And, if anyone was to sort of say one party or the other in terms of the House, they would probably be lying to you. The data is so close. I think Republicans do have the advantage in terms of they have more seats that are like sort of more polling indicates that they will have it. But again, these toss-up seats are just too hard to dictate. I think that what's going to be interesting is just in terms of the way that people feel about politics. And it is driven again as by this presidential what's happening at the presidential level. And I think things that we see in terms of the economy, because we're finding in polling that the economy is sort of driving how people are thinking about Trump and how they're thinking about Harris. And so things that I'm looking forward toward are sort of, interest rate cuts, mortgage, if they can mortgage rates, if they continue to decline, whether that sort of puts some sort of ease. And I know that, there's only 2 months or so to the election, and those ripple effects take a little bit more time to be felt. But if there's sort of positive headlines, maybe that is something that will decide these sort of almost toss-up races.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to take a look at some key factors that might help determine who comes out on top in the Senate and the House in just a moment. Our guests today include Alex Bolton. Alex is a senior staff writer at The Hill, a newspaper offering in-depth reporting on the politics and policy in our national legislature, where he covers Congress and the broader American political scene. Also with us is Sarah Ferris. She covers Congress for Politico, a multimedia platform that is all politics all the time. A native of Newtown, Connecticut, she has also reported for The Hill and the Washington Post. And with us is Naomi Lim. Naomi is White House reporter at the Washington Examiner. She previously reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. Let's take a look at a couple of the factors that might have an impact on these important races. In the presidential level, there are some themes that the candidates are trying to emphasize. For Trump, it's border security. For Harris, it's reproductive rights. When you get down to local races, state races for Senate and for House, do these themes resonate in the same sort of way? Sarah, let me begin with you.
Yeah, these are absolutely themes that we're hearing trickle down to Senate races and House races. As we've been talking about, partisan politics is so strong that once a presidential contender has introduced a theme, this really does seem, this then usually will unite the entire party behind that. And you'll see ads maybe run by the presidential and the Senate and the House kind of coordinated campaigns. This is really common. So we've seen a lot of, for example, border district Republican House seats where the immigration is obviously a huge issue. They can run ads where Donald Trump is talking about this, where he talks about how he wants to build the border wall, and we can see border district Democrats taking a different tact, where they're forced to move themselves away from the Biden administration. And similarly, we've seen the Democratic candidates, for example, trying to unseat New York Republicans in the blue state of New York, where abortion rights is a really big issue. We've seen how Republicans there have been forced to change their language. They're forced to really talk about abortion in a different way because of the way that Democrats, and particularly the Democratic candidates there, have forced them on the defense. So these are, in fact, the same themes we saw last cycle. We're hearing much more about the economy now, as Naomi hinted. We're seeing interest rates are also going to be a really big factor as everyone's watching the inflation numbers go down. So I think we'll definitely see these three things: the immigration and border security and reproductive rights and the economy are going to be likely what drives the elections through November.
Interesting. So now the national election, the presidential election, is, as everyone now discusses, is focused on a half a dozen battleground states. But they're not really the states that we've been talking about when it comes to determining the outcome of the congressional election. I mean, this is not Montana. This is not Texas, California, New York. Those are the states that came up in our conversation so far. So how do parties and candidates deal with these two different sets of states? States that will determine the presidential vote, states that will determine the outcome of the congressional vote. Alex?
Well, there is actually quite a bit of overlap in the Senate races and the presidential race. I mean, let's look at Arizona. That's a Senate battleground. It's also a presidential battleground. Nevada, Senate battleground, presidential battleground. Same with Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. So there is a fair amount of overlap. Where there is an overlap, as you pointed out, Montana and Ohio. The biggest ramification of that really is that you don't have a lot of good polling in those states where there aren't there isn't a contested presidential race. So in Ohio and Montana, since they are likely to be won by Trump by large margins, we don't have a very good sense of who's up, who's down. Whereas in Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, we are seeing a lot of regular polling. So you have two classes of Senate races: those that are presidential battlegrounds and those that aren't. Where there's a competitive Senate race in a presidential battleground, you're seeing a lot of shared similarity in messaging between the Harris campaign and the Democratic candidate. It's actually worked out pretty well because the same issues that will drive voters to the polls for Kamala Harris in Arizona and Nevada will be the same ones that will drive Democrats to the polls for Ruben Gallego in Arizona or Jackie Rosen in Nevada. Now, in Ohio and Montana, what you have going on, and I tell you the truth, I think Sherrod Brown and John Tester are glad that they're not presidential battlegrounds because it helps them run away from initially Joe Biden, and now they're keeping their distance from Kamala Harris. So what they're really trying to do, as it was mentioned, I think, by Sarah and Naomi earlier, is that these Senate candidates are trying to establish their own brand. They did not go to the Democratic convention in Chicago. They're keeping arm's distance from Harris. But, at the same time, they're not disappointed that Harris is in the race. I mean, I've talked to some of these, campaigns, before Joe Biden dropped out. They say that Joe Biden was running so poorly in their states that, Harris could only do better. In Montana, for example, there are a fair number of young voters. Either they're at Montana State in Bozeman or they're at University of Montana, Missoula. If Harris can juice up the young vote like she is said to be able to do, that could help Tester. If in Ohio she can drive Black voters to the polls, that can rev up the vote in Cuyahoga County. That could help Sherrod Brown. So there's overlap in some races, not in others. But I think across the board, the Democratic Senate candidates need the top of the ticket, Kamala Harris, to drive voters to the polls to rev up their Democratic bases.
So, Naomi, let me ask you this question. For many years, Republicans like to harp on the Democratic leader of the House, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, as sort of symbolism of liberal elites running Congress. Did the personalities who lead the two parties in the House and the Senate, are they key factors in any of these races? From where I sit, one doesn't hear that much about the Speaker of the House or the or Chuck Schumer in the Senate, Mike Johnson in the House, Chuck Schumer. I mean, are they motivating factors in any of these elections the way Nancy Pelosi sort of captured the imagination of so much of the electorate in previous elections?
Well, I think that's a really good observation, and I think that you're correct. I think that Democrats are trying to make House Speaker Mike Johnson sort of a similar, sort of a conservative version of a Nancy Pelosi, just in terms of particularly, some of his stances on abortion and more extreme policies like that. I think that he's probably done a good job at distancing himself from that as he tries to bring together his very sort of chaotic caucus or conference at the same time. And I also think on the flip side of that, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries is not this sort of, he's not being sort of demonized as this sort of radical leftist figure as the Republicans did to, again, Pelosi. I think it's been interesting that the Trump campaign has had difficulty sort of using those same labels with the vice president, with Kamala Harris, because she is, again, from San Francisco, very similar to Nancy Pelosi.
So it sounds like we're going to have to stay up late on November 5th. It might not even be until after then before we find out what the real result is of this other set of important elections that will be happening just a few weeks from now. So let me thank you, Alex Bolton, Sarah Ferris, and Naomi Lynn for helping to explain Congress and the vote that Americans will be facing on November 5th. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة فيما يتعلق بتقسيم السلطات بين السلطتين التنفيذية والتشريعية للحكومة، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.